Hello Brain Shakers, Brave Alice is here from the Brain Shakers Academy, and I welcome you to today's session where we complete looking at the menstrual cycle. And in today we're going to be looking at the uterine cycle. Now, we did look at how the menstrual cycle is actually regulated by looking at the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, and we also looked at the ovarian cycle, which is the first part of the uterine of the menstrual cycle that we did look at. In today's session we'll be looking at the uterine cycle, which is the second part of the cycle that happens during the process of menstruation. Now, let's quickly look at what happens during the uterine cycle. Now, just from the terminology itself here, from our heading, uterine, it means this is what happens within the uterus. We looked at the ovarian, what happens in the ovary. Now we're looking at uterine, what happens within the uterus. Now, I have drawn something that appears more or less like an endometrium here, and I have termed it from day 1, 14, and then 28. And even as we are explaining this uterine cycle, we are using a cycle that has on an average 28 days, which is a 28-day cycle. Now, if you remember, and if you have looked at the video that I have done on the ovarian cycle, which occurs concurrently with the uterine cycle, the last portion of that particular video explains the decline in the progesterone and estrogen levels. And if you haven't looked at that video, please do check for that video on the Brain Shakers Academy's YouTube page, and don't forget as well to subscribe, give a thumbs up, drop comments as well. I'd like to hear what you think. So, the beginning of the first stage in the process of the uterine cycle is the menstrual phase. Now, the uterine cycle can be broken down into the menses, or the menstrual period, and then you have what we are going to call the proliferative, which is also called the regenerative, and then we have the secretory phase. Okay, now the menstrual marks the first stage in the uterine cycle, and building on the ovarian cycle, when there is a drop in the progesterone and the estrogen levels, then the spiral arteries that supply this endometrium will go into spasms. So we are roughly around this stage, because this is where we want to see the shading of the functional layer of the endometrium. So these spiral arteries now will undergo spasms, and there will be production as well of prostaglandins. Now, when the spiral arteries undergo spasms, it means that there will be a decline in the amount of blood that is supplied to the region or the area, and because of that decline, then it undergoes a state of hypoxia or ischemia, where there is going to be a decline in the oxygen levels as well in that area. And because of that, and coupled with the spasms that will happen, then there will be shading of the top layer, which we called as the stratum functionalis. Okay, so there'll be a shading of that stratum functionalis, and then marking the beginning of the uterine cycle. And the first day of bleeding then will be the first day of the uterine cycle. Now, the bleeding itself, if clots do occur, there is an element within the system that is known as plasminogen. Okay, now plasminogen is an inactive form, meaning it is not active. It is in its inactive form, but has to be activated to an active form, which is known as plasmin. So the plasmin then digests the clots, so that what is going to come and appear as a menstrual flow will just be light bleeding and not clots. So it's the functionality of the plasmin that has been converted from plasminogen. So the menstruation period there now marks the first stage of the uterine cycle. And then we get to the proliferative phase. Now that this stratum functionalis layer, this top layer, has been gotten rid of, what then happens? Remember, in the other cycle we did talk about the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So the proliferative phase is in line with the follicular phase, and then the luteal phase is in line. So you have the luteal phase here, and then you have the follicular phase on the other end, and then here you have the proliferative, and then on the other end you will have the secretory phase. So this is in line with the follicular phase, and during this stage there is production or high amounts of follicle stimulating hormone, and at the same time the Graafian follicle that is being developed or that is dominant produces high amounts of estrogen. So it is the high amounts of estrogen that are being produced that then help in the repair of this functional layer that has now been gotten rid of. So estrogen now comes into play here to build onto the stratum basalis, so that you have a layer which is the stratum functionalis, or a layer on top that was shed now begins to repair or to grow again. So that is what is happening in the proliferative or the regenerative phase. In short, there is proliferation of new cells or regeneration of that particular layer. Now, the proliferative and the regenerative or the regenerative phase is almost the longest phase of all the phases. And this is where now the duration of the menstrual cycle lies. So it is dependent on the proliferative or regenerative phase, and this is a phase that differs. In some it is going to be longer, in some it is going to be shorter, thereby determining the duration or the number of days for somebody's cycle. The secretory phase and the rest of the other phases will remain within the average calculated days, but the proliferative and or the regenerative phase is what makes a cycle either shorter or longer. So it means how long it takes to regenerate or how long it takes to build up a new functional or stratum functionalis is what is going to determine the number of days that cycle is going to have. Then from there, obviously you would have had around the 14th day, you would have had a stage of ovulation there, and once ovulation has happened, then you move into the secretory stage. So the secretory stage is analogous to the luteal phase, and we did mention that in the luteal phase, in the ovarian cycle, you have high amounts of luteinizing hormone, and on the other end you have high amounts of progesterone. Now we did see what estrogen does, that is, it provides and produces cervical mucus that is not viscous. Now here, because you have a high amount of progesterone being produced, you have now an effect on that cervical mucus that was being produced, and then it becomes viscous now, because this is more secretory, because what is going to happen also is that these glands and the arteries or the blood vessels that are supplying the area become more tortuous, and they have more blood now that is coming to the area, meaning the glands that are there are going to bring about more secretion and deposition of minerals there and other important elements such as glycoproteins. And so the secretory phase now will see a rise in the progesterone amount, making the cervical mucus more viscous, and also at the same time making the myometrium not to contract, because if the myometrium does contract, so progesterone has an anti-contraction effect, if I may put it in that way, that is inhibiting the contraction effect of the myometrium, so that pregnancy then can be allowed to continue until term. So the glands that are within the uterus there become more tortuous and ready to produce their secretions, just in case after ovulation pregnancy is elicited, so that the environment now is made in such a way that it is more welcoming for the implantation of that fertilized ovum once it has gotten to the uterus. And as you look at the secretory phase also being analogous to the luteal phase, what is going to happen is that you still have the corpus luteum here that is still producing the progesterone and the estrogen. And in terms of the estrogen, we've already made mention of the estradiol that is playing key role, but with the secretory affairs, it is more of the progesterone hormone that is being produced. So that is what is happening in the uterine cycle. Now, you cannot only just discuss about the menstrual cycle without also making mention that there are certain abnormalities or conditions that we do see and notice when we are discussing issues to do with the menstrual cycle. Some of the things we would talk about are amenorrhea. Okay, this is just absent menses, and this is something that you would obviously see when somebody has gotten pregnant because of the negative feedback mechanism that will then happen, so that there is no other cycle to continue. But there are so many things that can actually make someone miss their menses. Bereavement as well can make someone miss menses. Stress and all those things can also make someone miss menses. You have issues to do with dysmenorrhea. Okay, these are painful menses. Some people may end up needing treatment for these. Most of the abnormalities with the menstrual cycle are things that can actually be handled, and they are things that someone would be able to bear with. But if they get to a stage where they need treatment, then they may be treated for obviously dysmenorrhea. And then you have also oligomenorrhea. Okay, these are just scanty amounts of menses. And then you have also menorrhagia. These are heavy periods. So if they get to a stage where they are having these heavy periods, these ones are more prone to what we call iron deficiency anemia. And so if they reach this stage, they may actually need further treatment or iron supplements just to make sure that they do not get into that stage. There are other abnormalities and other conditions that occur, such as hypermenorrhea and things like that. But basically that is about the uterine cycle. And so we have looked at the menstrual cycle in totality. We know what now controls the menstrual cycle. We've mentioned about all those hormones. We've looked at the two main cycles, that is the uterine cycle and the ovarian cycle, and some of the common problems that you're going to see and notice during the period of menstruation, until you reach a stage of the cessation of menses, which we call as menopause. So from the time that menses begin, which we called menarche, to a period when the menses do cease, which is menopause, there'll be a fluctuation or an alternation in those phases just to get the processes going, because there is automated reaction of those glands that we did make mention of, which is the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. Now, if you did find this particular video interesting and helpful in understanding the menstrual cycle, please give it a thumbs up, like, share as much as possible. Drop me comments in the comments section. I would like to hear from you as well, and I would be interested to have you on this platform. So please do remember to subscribe if you have not yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, which is Brain Shakers Academy. And as always, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one.